I want to talk about a project that is very near and dear to my heart, that I've been chipping away at since 2011. And I thought that the easiest way to introduce this, let's see if this actually works. It doesn't work. The easiest way to introduce this might be with an absolutely breathtaking act of hubris, and I'm going to quote myself, mostly because this is a little bit from the introduction to the Pennsylvania Heritage article that I did about Fort Halifax last year, and it's probably the best introduction that I know of to the fort and how it all happened. So bear with me and forgive me. As the fleet of Bateaux slipped into the lee of what would be called Clemson Island and Lingle Island, along the east shore of the mile-wide Susquehanna River, the smoke from the Armstrong family's compound would have been visible to the men in the boats, as would the distinctive hook-shaped mouth of the creek that enters the riverbed. Aboard the 20-odd Bateaux and several dugout canoes were a contingent of some 400 British colonial troops, most of them very young men, accompanied by a parson, roughly 20 officers and non-commissioned officers, and in some cases, the officers' wives and families. Originally formed as the 3rd Battalion of the Pennsylvania Colonials, they became known as the Augusta Regiment. Their mission was to establish a fort at the forks of the Susquehanna in what is now the town of Sunbury, but was then a recently abandoned Native American refugee settlement called Shamokin. On their way to the forts, they were to select a location for a supply and munitions outpost somewhere between Hunter's Fort, just north of modern Harrisburg, and the planned location of Fort Augusta. This landing seemed perfect to the brigade's commander, William Clapham. The river terraces overlooked the channel between the islands and the mainland, so no movement along the east bank of the river would escape the notice of the garrison. There was also a good landing for the vessels that would carry munitions and men between the forks of the river and the settlements downstream. Robert and Alexander Armstrong's family compound included a sawmill that would help process the timbers needed for the fort's defensive works. And the Armstrongs were undoubtedly well connected with the network of other pioneer families in the area and with the local Native American residents. As the regiment debarked from the Bateaux on June 6, 1756, they mustered into their companies to receive orders. The following day, they began to strike their first blows against the French and their native allies, not with their muskets, but with shovels and axes. They set to building a 160 square fort that would be garrisoned and used as a supply depot for about a year and a half before being abandoned and partially dismantled. Clapham initially referred to this fort as, quote, the camp at Armstrong's, in correspondence with Governor Robert Morris. Morris wrote back to Clapham and asked the fort be named in honor of George Montague Dunk, the 2nd Earl of Halifax. On that same June day that the Augusta Regiment landed at the Armstrong compound, it is a near certainty that concealed in the woods on the height of land east of the building, or east of the landing, or perhaps in the dense forests and thickets of the river islands just to the west, other, also mostly young men, were quietly observing them. They had likely immigrated to the Susquehanna Valley from their birthplaces along the Delaware River, or traveled recently from the Ohio Valley. They may have spoken Shawnee, Munsee, Unami, or any of several other Algonquian languages. They would not have known Governor Morris's plans for the expedition, but they would have understood that the heavily armed men in the Bateaux and the canoes were not a good sign. And that's how I think it went down. We have some primary evidence for where Fort Halifax stood from the period. We all know Shippensburg. One of that very famous colonial family, Colonel Joseph Shipman, was a captain in the regiment in 1756. And he was the secretary and correspondent on part of this expedition. We know that this map, which really was just published in a historical journal about 10 years ago, was drawn by Joseph Shipman. And it depicts all of the colonial forts, prominent settlements, and natural features between Hunter's Fort, where Fort Hunter Park is, down here, and the forts of the Susquehanna. And it is the first regional map that depicts the location of Fort Halifax. Another primary document that we've known about for a long time is what's called Gratz map. It's from the Gratz family collection of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. It's actually unattributed, but looking at Captain Shipman's lettering and his writing on letters and journals and other things that he kept, and this map, it seems pretty clear that we think this drawing was done by Joseph Shipman. And that means it was drawn by an eyewitness. And if you'll notice, there are actual dimensions on everything. And we believe it's the most accurate eyewitness depiction of what Fort Halifax looked like. To talk about this period of Pennsylvania history, and especially our part of the world, I wanted to provide a little bit of context about what's known in North America as the French and Indian War, what's known in Canada and most everywhere else as the 7 Years' War, which was, in fact, it was a war between colonial France and colonial Britain. It was also the First World War, which is not something most folks think about when they think about the 18th century. But in fact, there were theaters in the 7 Years' War in Europe, obviously, the Caribbean, the Philippines, South America, Africa, and almost as an afterthought, North America. So in fact, this was a worldwide conflict. Who was involved in it? Well, obviously, if it's worldwide, lots of people. But here in North America, the first people to talk about it, I think, are the first people that were here. And that is the indigenous folks that lived in what's now Pennsylvania. A good way to think about pre-colonial Native American people is by language families. People would certainly distinguish themselves by tribes, but a lot of tribes spoke similar languages and would have recognized each other as somehow related. That, by the way, does not mean they were always at peace with each other, but they would have recognized that they share some level of cultural kinship. There were a lot of Algonquian-speaking people in what's now eastern Pennsylvania, and actually also the Ohio Valley. When I use that term, I'm talking about Delaware or Lenape people living along the Delaware River. I'm talking about a lot of the tribes of New England. Micmac come to mind. There's a lot of other ones. A lot of Great Lakes tribes. They refer to themselves as Anishinaabe. You hear the term Chippewa or Ojibwe or whatever. Those are also Algonquian-speaking people. Most of those folks, initially and well into the 18th century, were in trading alliances and very familiar with the French. And that's especially true around the Great Lakes and in Canada and the St. Lawrence, but even here. In Native America, the 500-pound gorilla in the room in this part of the world is always the Haudenosaunee. The word we were probably all raised with was Iroquois. The 5 nations or 6 nations of Iroquois-speaking people in central and southern New York. They never used that word. By the way, they use Haudenosaunee. Iroquois is a name that Algonquian-speaking people gave them that was then Frenchified. But they call themselves Haudenosaunee people of Longhouse. They were initially 5 allied nations across the central tier of New York. From east to west, we're talking Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, the Great Lakes. And then in the 18th century, they were joined by their Tuscarora cousins, who actually originally, when this place was colonized by the British, the Tuscarora lived in the Carolinas. And they found their new neighbors so unpleasant that they migrated north to live near their Haudenosaunee relatives in New York. The Haudenosaunee were, during the 7 Years' War, they desperately tried to stay neutral, but in fact, going all the way back to Saint-Roch de Champlain, they had problems with the French because Champlain sided with some of their Algonquian enemies and actually fired them with firearms. They remembered it. And if you talk to folks in upstate New York that live on the reservations up there to this day, they still remember it. It happened a long time ago. So during the war, really, especially the eastern tribes of the Iroquois, the Mohawks, Oneidas, solidly aligned with the British. As you got further west and closer to the Great Lakes, people became more lukewarm. By the time you get to the Seneca land, some of the Seneca were actually openly supporting the French. At the time of the French-Indian War in our little corner of the world, there were a lot of refugee Algonquian-speaking people that had begun their lives on the Delaware River and had been pushed out by an early colonial expansion coming out of Philadelphia. If you've ever heard of the walking purchase, a lot of those people wound up in the Susquehanna Valley. And we are talking about kind of mixes of distinct bands of people, Unami, Piscataway, Conoy, some Shawnee people, all living together in these refugee towns. There was, as I mentioned in the introduction, a big refugee town in where Sunbury is now, called Shamokin, just to confuse things, because the modern town of Shamokin is nowhere near where the Native American town was. But there was another big refugee town in Conestoga, in Lancaster County. There was one supposedly where the Cumberland was, and scattered around. So here were these people living in the Susquehanna Valley that were pretty far from where they were born. They had old, long-standing trading affiliations with the French colonials. They were surrounded by English colonials. And the Haudenosaunee had a claim to the upper Susquehanna Valley by virtue of the Albany Treaty in 1722 the Haudenosaunee laid claim to the Susquehanna Valley from like Hunter's Fort north. And in fact, they even sent an Oneida emissary to live down near the Indian town of Shamokin named, have you ever heard of the name Shekhalemi? He was an Oneida diplomat. Spoke half a dozen different languages, by the way. One of the most fascinating people on the Pennsylvania frontier. He was sent down from New York to live close to Shamokin to kind of advocate for the Confederacy and also to keep an eye on things. And there were these refugee people kind of stuck between the English and the Iroquois with old relationships with the French. And they had to watch everything they said and everything they did. And when war finally broke out, most of those people wound up aligning themselves with the French. And so when the war broke out, Braddock's defeat in 1755, most of those refugee towns were abandoned because they weren't safe anymore. Obviously, also living here were colonial Brits. So my father's people, mostly Scots, Irish, and German immigrants. Primarily, these folks got here because they left really violent, really poor places in Europe and came here very early on. And some of them, particularly Scots-Irish families, pushed way out onto the frontier and were living in family compounds with no paper. We're going to hear about that in a minute. No formal land claims whatsoever. But a lot of them flocked to Colonial Philadelphia, Carlisle, Colonial Lancaster, and kind of all lived together in these little enclaves, these little communities. And they had, unlike their cousins out on the edge of the frontier, a lot of these folks had very, very little first-person exposure to Native Americans. Like, they never saw them, and they were scared of them. In western Pennsylvania, in the Ohio Valley, and up around Erie, and on, obviously up into Canada, there was a pretty dense population of colonial French people that lived here. These were mostly immigrants from Normandy, Gascony, northern and central France. A lot of them were Protestants. If you ever heard the term Huguenots, they were kind of almost chased out of the country at gunpoint and wound up here. Their relationships with the tribes were very, very different because the French model of immigration was very different than the British one. Most British immigrants came here with their families. You know, everybody piled onto the ship and everybody showed up together. New France was colonized almost exclusively by single men. Women were not sent. Priests were sent and single men were sent. So in New France, there was a lot of intermarriage between French colonists and native people. And so the French were way more integrated into Native American life and culture than a lot of the British ever got. That's not a hard and fast rule, but that's the truth. And then finally, there were plenty of both British and French continental troops and sailors that never immigrated here. You know, they came here from the old country, spent the war here. Some of them stuck around, most of them went home. But that's kind of the mix of people and worlds that collided when the First World War broke out. Yeah. As I said at the beginning of this, Fort Halifax was only a going concern for like 18 months. That's how long there was a garrison there. It was abandoned because they really discovered that they didn't need an intermediary post between Hunter's Fort and Augusta to keep Augusta supplied, so they didn't feel like it was worthwhile keeping the garrison there. And also the fort, if you did, this is a old map here, but the fort was kind of situated here, and there's these archaeological islands right here, so you can see the eastern shore of the river really well, but you can't see what's going on the western side of it. So they didn't keep a garrison there after 18 months. As I said, frontier era, mostly Scots-Irish colonial settlers often didn't have any paper. They just squatted. This is the Armstrong's original deed. It's dated 1763 by Robert Armstrong. That's their original land deed. By 1756, when the fort is built, they've been there so long, they have a sawmill and big compound buildings and God knows what else. And they had no legal claim to anything whatsoever until 1763. And that's actually kind of typical of the Pennsylvania frontier. That's not an unusual situation at all. The Armstrongs owned this property legally from 1763 till they start selling off pieces before too long, but they're largely out of the picture by the 1820s when the Geigers buy basically the southern half of their ground from them. The Geigers built a farmhouse and a barn. 1820s, that's the barn, it's still there. And so it's a farmhouse. One of their daughters marries a man named Gray. The Grays built another farm just a couple hundred yards further up the river, right about there where the point is. That's this 1858 map. By the time the 1900 map is made, the first U.S. Geological Survey map in that part of the valley, it's gone. There ain't no Gray farmstead, so it's gone. Hold on a minute, let the little old man catch up with his notes. In the 1830s, the Pennsylvania Canal is built north-south across the property. It's right about here. And in the 1850s, the first Pennsylvania rail line was built, and it's right next to the canal. So they both kind of run north-south, kind of like right here through the property. In about 1950, descendants of the Geiger family sell out to a family named Yeager. The Yeagers built a house in the early 50s. It's kind of right down here. Actually, that's it. That's it. And they farmed this ground from about 1950 to 2004. And Mr. Yeager's still around. He's still very much with us. They sold out in 2004 to the Central Pennsylvania Conservancy. Now, something I wanted to mention is, this place has been farmed since the Armstrongs. They were farming it before the fort was there, and it was farmed for 200 years after the farm. And above ground evidence of the fort became more and more rare with each passing year. In 1890, I want to say, let me get the date on this. Yeah, in the 1890s, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania forms the Commission to identify the colonial forts. And they publish a report, they make an effort to go out and document what's left of the French and Indian War and Revolutionary War era forts in Pennsylvania. And in the 1890s, there was still apparently a wellhead visible from Fort Halifax. And they also drafted this map in the 1890 report of Fort Halifax, which if you look at it, doesn't look a whole lot like the map that the eyewitness map does. There's this kind of round bastion and so on. There's a well actually depicted in that bastion. Um, but, that clearly would have been based on hearsay and on, people's fragmentary memory of what might have been around there in the early 18th century. So even by the 1890s, my point is that the memory of this place is starting to fade. And by the time the Yeagers were there, Mr. Yeager said, I never saw anything that I could identify as being part of that fort for all the years I farmed here. So he sells out in 2004 to the Central Pennsylvania Conservancy. The Conservancy 2 years later, 2006, conveys this land to Halifax Township. Actually, it's a plot of land that goes well over this side of River Road, 174, to become a township park. It's 74 or 75 acres. In 2008 or thereabouts, a nonprofit is formed, Friends of Fort Halifax Park, to advocate for the establishment of the park. And about that time, the township and the Friends pulled together a grant proposal to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania Keystone Grant for a plan to develop the park. And that plan is completed around 2009, and shortly thereafter, I got a phone call. There's a plan, which, like, there's the river, all this stuff. Yeah, none of that stuff ever happened. But they have a plan. I was working at the Department of Transportation at the time, and I got a phone call from Cindy Dunn, who was the Secretary of DCNR right now. Back then, she was Deputy Secretary of DCNR, saying, we gave this municipality a grant. They developed this plan. They want to do stuff, but they have no idea where this fort is or if it even exists. And they asked my bosses, can you loan us Joe Baker and FAST program for a few days to try to find it? FAST, there's our old logo, is a student co-op initiative that we developed with Indiana University of Pennsylvania back in 2010, where we cycle undergraduate and graduate students through work on real projects and prepare them for a career in resource management work. FAST is still a thing, it's still up and running. I met the newest FAST crew here a few weeks ago, and I'm proud to say I retired in 2019 and I started this program. I'm very proud to say they had no idea who I was. That is, guys, that is a sign of success. That is a sign of success. The program is going. And I've got, dozens and dozens and dozens of students scattered all over the country that went through that program. Anyway, I hauled out the 2011 FAST crew to Fort Halifax, and we did ground penetrating radar survey in the northern part of that field that you saw in maps. And, we saw a few mildly interesting things, and then we came back with a couple of volunteer weekend excavations. I'm going to say 2012 and 2014. Two students completed master's theses and did a lot of excavation and testing on site. One student from IUP, one student from Northern Arizona University. And the Society for Historical Archaeology sponsored a metal detecting workshop at Fort Halifax in 2016. So we did all this work in all those years, and there's, surprise, there's good news and bad news. We got lots of period artifacts. We got, hundreds of lead balls, all of them in the right diameters and right calibers for military and personal weapons from this time period. We got lots of coins, and a lot of them are in the right age range. We also got a lot of the brass buttons that were, again, in the right age range. We got a ton of handmade metalwork. Those are straight nails, which you find on the wheels of wooden wheels on carts that we used to convey things. The other thing, and it's funny when I talk to people about Fort Halifax, especially other archaeologists, and they're really excited because there's a cool fort there. I have to stop and remind them that Fort Halifax is primarily a Native American archaeological site. I have rarely seen so many pre-European, pre-contact artifacts in one place in my life. The place is a pavement of little chips of rhyolite and jasper and flint. There are 3 little pieces of Native American ceramics here that span the period from 1300 AD to about 1400 AD to Susquehanna. Scattered around that field. I mean, goodness knows they were there from at least 8,000 years ago to right when Europeans arrived, and in great numbers. I heard a really funny conversation between my buddy Jonathan Burns, who you're going to be here in a second, who's the lead archaeologist on this project, and another friend of mine, Sid Jameson, who is Native American from Lewisburg. And Jonathan told Sid, there's so much Native American stuff on this property that it's like when I'm trying to figure out what's going on with the fort, it's like it's the noise on this site. And Sid smiled and said, no, man, the noise on this site is the fort. Everything depends on how you look at things. That was the good news. We found a lot of artifacts that were clearly related to something in the middle of the 18th century. The bad news is, and I'm going to have to drop an archaeology term here, is we didn't find any features. What do I mean by feature? Let's back up. What do I mean by an artifact? Something you can pick up and put in your pocket. A feature is some evidence of human land use that you can't pick up and put in your pocket. A foundation, for example, is a good example of a feature. A cooking fire, or a trash pit, or something, the remains of a wooden post, whatever. Those are features. We got all these artifacts. We don't have a single feature coming out. There were some Native American features, some pre-contact features, but there were no historic features related to the fort or to the area. There was one dump that had some stuff in it, but it seemed like it was more related to the Gray family farm than it was to anything else. So it was pretty frustrating. But we certainly had some information. So in 2020, I guess it was, I got into a conversation with the Friends of Fort Halifax Park, and my old friend Jonathan Burns, there he is doing his thing. Jonathan teaches at Junior College. He's 15 years younger than me, but we both had the same professor at Penn State as our mentor, so we go way back. He is pretty well known in the little circles that I live in because he dug Fort Shirley at Shirleysburg. He dug Fort Robideau. He's dug at Fort LaBeef. He's really the guy in Pennsylvania that kind of knows more about colonial period military sites than anybody else. I talked to Jonathan, I talked to the folks at the Friends of Fort Halifax Park, and I agreed to start writing grants, and we wrote a grant proposal to the Commonwealth, a Keystone grant, and one to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, a Louis Appel grant, and lo and behold, we got them both. So, in 2021, we did a 3-week-long field school at Fort Halifax, and we did a couple of things different than what I had been doing. First of all, there is an old, 1920s era Historical Museum Commission historic marker out on 147 that said, in 1920s, it says 500 feet west of here stood Fort Halifax, blah, blah, blah. And so Jonathan said to me, we're going to look 500 feet west of that rock. Like, all right, I can tell you where it's not, and I didn't look there, so sure, why not? The other thing we did was do a lot of metal detecting in an area that we had not done any metal detecting before. We used some friends of ours from something called the Veterans Curation Program. Sonny's last name. One of the former archaeologists at the Army Corps of Engineers started a program for deployed veterans to start to teach them the skill set that you would need to work in resource management, archaeology, curation, historic preservation work. It's been really successful. And those guys really take to it, and they especially take to it when they're working on a military site. Surprise, surprise. So we had a cadre of veterans who had been deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq working with us doing the metal detecting ahead of us. And then we did a little bit more ground penetrating radar work, and we did a lot of traditional, this is the shovel, this is the end you all of the tube. This is the end that goes to the ground. Archaeology work. They started the metal detecting first. On the first day, I was helping to set up a field lab in the Yeager's old house, and somebody came and got me and said, I think you better come over here and look at something. So Dave Williams, one of our veterans, had started metal detecting that morning, and he found a copper coin. It was a French coin, a diar, which is basically a penny. It was pretty old and worn out, but there was one thing that just was perfectly legible, and that was the strike date right there of 1655. That coin was in circulation for a century before Fort Halifax was built. By the time they were done with the metal detecting, they found a bunch of coins, and God knows how many lead balls, but 7 of the coins were French, something I want to return to in a little bit. They found imported, a fair amount of imported British ceramics, including that scratch blue stoneware. That stuff was exclusively manufactured in Great Britain and was not manufactured at all after about 1760. So it is right where, chronologically speaking, it's right where it ought to be. And it's also kind of expensive, fancy, high status wear, the sort of thing that you might find around officers, but certainly not listed there. And then just a ton of metal artifacts came out of that. That is, if y'all know what a juice harp is, there's one right there. Again, we were swimming in 18th century artifacts. Before this started, I told somebody here, I haven't seen this much 18th century stuff in one place since the last time I worked in Old City, Philadelphia. That's how much stuff there is in this part of the site. And, but no features. And I'm like, I'm dying. All right. So if you get around a bunch of archaeologists in a bar, which I highly recommend, because it's usually a good time, you're going to hear them start talking about something called the rule. The rule. What is the rule? Here's the rule. You will find whatever. You will find King Tunstallum. You will find, a tree of real gold. You will find whatever it is you're looking for on the last day of the project. And we're all laughing, but I can't tell you how often this actually happened. So on the last afternoon of the last day of the 2021 project, this nice young man, Isaiah Cullum, who I was kind of hoping would show up here today because his girlfriend lives here in Carlisle, walked over to me and said, Mr. Baker, could you come look at something? "Sure, young man." And I walk over to this hole in the ground, and he has done a beautiful job cleaning up. And I see that there's a nice straight line here, another one here, one coming off at a right angle here. And this is very dark, organic soil, full of 18th century stuff. And I looked at it and I looked at him and I said, "Don't touch that." And I walked over to Jonathan, who it was the last day of the project. And Jonathan was standing at a surveying instrument, desperately trying to map in several hundred things that we had found with metal detectors. And it was also at 90-something degrees. And I said, "John, you need to come over here." And he looked at me and said, "I'm busy." Actually, there were more words to the sentence than "I'm busy," but none of them I can repeat here. And I said, "Actually, you're not that busy, but you're about to get real busy." And so he came over, and what we have here, remember I said that the Armstrongs had a sawmill? This is the base of what's called a revetment. If you want to see a revetment, go over to the Army Heritage Center where they have the reproduction of the little French and Indian War fort. A revetment is a fortification that has at its base square logs, and then soil and dirt is piled on top of that, and then sometimes pointy sticks are stuck out the outside. This is the edge of part of the defensive works of Fort Halifax. And it showed up in the last afternoon of the last day of the project in 2021. And a bottle of whiskey may have magically appeared late that afternoon after that happened. Maybe that happened. So we had the fort and we knew it. Coming out of that excavation, Friends of Fort Halifax Park won themselves a statewide preservation award from the State Historic Preservation Office. We immediately started to look around for more money. So in the winter time of 2022, I wrote grants to Keystone Commonwealth of Pennsylvania grant. I wrote another National Trust for Historic Preservation grant. And then just for a Hail Mary, I wrote a National Park Service American Battlefield Protection Program grant. Figured we're going to get 2 of these, right? And we got all 3. So, yeah, that never happened. And Matthew, I told Jonathan when that happened, I mean, he was ecstatic. I told him, "Jonathan, trust me, I'm older than you are, I've been doing this for a long time. It is possible to have too much money." And he laughed in my face. And I was right. I'll spare you the detail, but I was right. Anyway, we went back in the field with another 3-week-long field school in 2023. This time around, we tried some other kind of fancy geoarchaeology methodologies. We worked here with some of the folks from Dickinson. There's a drone there, and that drone is flying the north field with heat-sensitive LiDAR cameras. That's the bunch of us that had photographed with the heat camera. Looking to see if there's any subsurface evidence of retention of heat. Didn't work. We also pulled out a resistivity meter, which is kind of the opposite of a radar machine. It shoots an electronic current through the ground, and what you're looking for are changes or breaks in the electronic current as it goes from one pole to another. Pretty iffy. We did a little bit more ground penetrating radar work, and we seemed to get some signatures out of that. And then we started digging and doing a little bit of metal detecting. Most of the metal detecting is on the 12-1. Although I got to tell you, one of the most remarkable things that happened in 2023, and perhaps some of you guys will remember this, is here we are set up with the surveying station on site. And that's the north end of the field at Fort Halifax, and that looks like river fog, yeah? That's not what that is, that's smoke. That's smoke from Canada. You guys remember that? Oh, yeah. Guys, it was so bad. And remember, these are kids, these are college kids. It was so bad, everyone was running around with masks on, and we had a very serious conversation about whether or not we should even be doing this. And then the weather changed. And it became a non-issue. But when we started, it was like that for a couple of 3 days. And there was a lot of, what are we going to do now? Conversations, but it finally went away. A ton of period artifacts again, a lot of ceramics. For those of you who know anything about archaeology, there's a not insignificant amount of what's called Delft ware, DELFT. It's exclusively imported stuff that comes from Holland and later from Great Britain, but it's the right period for the middle of the 18th century. And again, kind of high status ceramic that you would only see around probably offices. We got, any of you know what that is? That is the winding key for an 18th century pocket watch. And again, who's going to have a pocket watch on the Pennsylvania frontier in the middle of the 18th century? A lot of high status stuff. And also kind of more low down stuff. Anybody know what that is? It's a dice. A die. It's a bone die that we found near the two foundations that turned up in 2023. Two dry laid stone masonry foundations of two buildings separated from each other by about 30 yards. One would, looking at the old 18th century map, one would line up beautifully where one of the depicted buildings from Shippen's map was, and it's oriented north-south. The other one is over on the west side of the site, and it's kind of off at an angle, about 45 degrees off of north. And if you remember that map, well, I don't want to switch back to it now, but it shows a building inside one of the bastions, the pointy things that stick off the corner of the fort. There's one of these buildings that's on 45-degree angle that would be a pretty good fit for that. We found a whole lot more stuff, and we found two structures full of 18th century stuff again that are clearly related to the water. That was in 23. We had enough funding left over from 23, mostly because the geoarchaeology didn't work, that we went back out for 2 weeks this year. And this year we focused mostly on just digging. We had some signatures from the ground penetrating radar to follow up on. This is one of the two structures that turned up in 23, one's kind of on an angle, almost right next to it. Look at that. There's another little rectangular building, again, full of nothing but 18th century stuff, sitting right next to it. Over in this part of the site, there's a lot of evidence of sort of day-to-day life. There's, anybody know what that is? It's a thimble. People are repairing their uniforms and selling their clothes on. That is a large pewter button from what looks like an officer's coat. There's more of that fancy, expensive imported scratch blue stoneware from Great Britain, and a ton more ammunition, military stuff. So we got a big report to it right now, and we got some thinking to do about what we would like to maybe do next. Okay, the analysis is beginning now, and we know some things that we didn't know before, certainly 2011, when I started working here. We've got obviously 3 building locations and part of the revetment wall the fort. So, we're starting to get a picture of sort of a spatial arrangement of this place and where exactly it's sitting in the landscape. We had a lot of artifacts. Now, I want to return to that thing about the coins. That first coin that popped up was a French DR. There's probably a dozen or 15 total coins coming out of this part of the excavation. 7 of them are French. There's a half dozen gunfights that come out here. 2 of them are French. Among this huge collection of lead balls and ammunition, I think 3 of them are in the right diameter for the French Charleville musket and are not English. There's all this French stuff inside the English fort. And the people who are in the French trading network are the idiots. And I was having a conversation on site with Jonathan Burns and Dave Williams, who's one of our metal detectorists, who is, again, a deployed veteran. And I was like, what's all this French stuff going inside the fort? And Dave piped up and said, oh, I'd be shocked if it wasn't there. So, what do you mean? He said, look, man, when we were in Afghanistan and we were in Iraq, the locals came and went all the time. They were our interpreters. They came in for medical aid. We were supposed to be doing this hearts and minds thing. So, we were actually reaching out to them and having village elders come in for dinner. We were trying to establish connections with the local community. So yeah, they were inside all the time. And I don't think it was any different. And, Dave's not a professional archaeologist or a historian, but I remember standing there thinking, you know what? The experience of being deployed at the edge of the empire in the middle of nowhere in a really scary place. Because another thing that Dave said was, you could be chatting with one of these folks, one of these local folks, and holding his kid on your knee one day, and then the next day, that same guy could try to kill you. Or not. Or no. And it just dawned on me, the experience of being deployed in the middle of nowhere hasn't changed for like 2.5 centuries. It's the same. Everything's the same. And it was really, really interesting. There's a lot of fairly high status and important ceramics on the site, scratch blue, Delftware, the coat button. There's clearly officers billeted here along with the enlisted men, and they're here for the whole 18-month thing, which is kind of odd because this was a backwater in the middle of nowhere, especially compared to Fort Augusta. But they clearly left officers here. We have very little in the way of written records, day-to-day records of what was going on here. We know a little bit, but the archaeology has certainly started to fill in the gaps. And also, that higher status stuff, that more expensive ceramics, the officer stuff, it's definitely in a segregated part of the site from the rest of us. Which I also, for those of you who are in the military, other things haven't changed for a long time either. And there's little peeks into day-to-day life. There's the thimble, and I know what I want to return to is the dice, the die. About 2 yards away from where that die was found, just outside of one of the foundations in 2023, we found discarded remains of a horse scapula, the large shoulder bone of a horse that, I assume probably croaked on site and they ate because they were always short on rations. And we got that scapula into the lab and got it cleaned up, and we found this rectangular hole intentionally sawed into the bone. And then we took the dice and found out that it fit precisely into that hole. So that dice was manufactured on site by the guys that were living here so that they would have something to do. And, again, there are these little glimpses of day-to-day life that you don't see everywhere. There's still a lot we don't know. We don't have the whole fort boundary figured out here. Part of that is because the part of the site that's closest to the river, the west part of the site, was plowed a lot deeper and a lot harder than the eastern part of the site. So where we found the most intact of those revetment scars, those dark stains, they were all over on the east side where there was more soil. And everything that we're seeing over on the west side is going to have to be inferred because that stuff has been plowed out and gone. But we still have a lot of the eastern side of the site that we haven't tested yet at all. So we would like to get in there because we think if we can find two corners, we got one corner. If we can find two corners, we can make the square. We can figure out exactly where the footprint was. There's been talk forever that there's a well on the site. We haven't found it. We don't know where the gate was. Most of the depictions show the gate on the south side of the site. We haven't found it yet. We don't know how many other structures like the ones that we have found already there are out there. We have some things showing up on radar that would maybe make sense, but we have not had time to excavate there. We also really don't know a lot about, again, there's stuff inside the fort that seems like it's clearly coming from Native American visitation to the fort. We don't really understand what the relationship was between this isolated garrison and the people that lived around them, some of whom were lost, but were also not beyond visiting the site. And we also don't completely understand what the relationship was like between the garrison at the fort and the Armstrongs. The Armstrongs wrote to the governor and complained about the fort. So we know they were unhappy, but they were 100 yards away. So they also, were undoubtedly coming and going. And we don't know how many of these European artifacts or colonial artifacts may be related to the Armstrongs or to the garrison. I mean, there's some sort of stuff that's sort of obvious because it's military, but there's some that could be either way. We don't really know about that. So to address those things, we've got a big report to write right now that I'm on the hook for some of, and Jonathan's on the hook for most of it. And we would like to get back there and do a little bit more digging, especially on the eastern periphery, where we think the fort is, to see if we can find another corner and to start trying to answer some of those other unknowns. And we hope to be out there either next year, 2025, or 2026, if we can get some more support, which I think we probably can. All right, thanks again, guys.
Thanks, Joe.